all of you know Senator Murphy. I just want to say a couple of words about him. We are talking about happiness and loneliness, but I want to tell you that Senator Murphy, and a lot of the stress points we were just discussing, is one of the few senators who are willing to go out and focus a spotlight and ask, why is this happening? Why is Sandy Hook happening? Why is Israel-Gaza happening? What is going on? When he sees, he was in, I think it was today, in Semafor Principles, saying, what concerns me is America comes up 62nd in the level of youth in the world youth happiness here. So he also wrote a book that I highly commend to you. You should all order it, called The Violence Inside Us, on America's gun obsession, gun realities, gun problems. And I want to just start, Chris, and say, Grinnell just did a poll. I think it just came out today or last night. And this deals with something I want to discuss on social media, and said that enthusiasm for banning social media is much higher than banning guns and dealing with guns. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, listen,
that's in Iowa.
Yeah,
I should say that's in Iowa.
Well, listen, I mean, I think there is a real story in this country about people's frustration with technology, right? We've been sold this idea that technology as it developed was going to work for us, was going to make our lives easier, more efficient, connect us. I think there is a sense today that we work for technology, that technology rules us, that there are a group of elites that have figured out how to use technology to seek and take rents from us, to profit off of our labor, but that it's just not working any longer for regular people. I mean, just as soon as you thought you maybe had figured out social media, along comes an entirely new money system, right? It's dizzying for folks. I went to Silicon Valley and I said, you know what? If you just pressed pause on new technological development for 2 years in this country, there would be a lot of folks signing up. And in Silicon Valley, they can't believe, right, that anybody out there doesn't see the net benefit of technology. But social media is the clearest way that technology, unregulated and unchecked, can drive Americans mad, can pit us against each other, and can make people feel super unhappy about the experience of social media, but also unhappy about living in a country where your government doesn't seem to do anything about the things that are making you miserable, like unregulated social media.
What does the balance need to be? One of the things I struggle with and is the degree to which policymakers look at their fellow citizens as if they are guinea pigs, that social media can come and do this to them, or other things can come this to them. Where the agency of individual choice, individual action? Because what I see in the concerns about some of these impacts on the population is then another move on regulation. I'm just wondering, where is in the social contract, what is the element about individual critical thinking, critical choice in this? Because I got to tell you, in the discussions about the regulatory environment around technology and human beings, which I really sympathize with, we often deal with people as if they're, kind of creatures in this system being affected as if they're in a, Skinner box.
No, listen, I've given, as you mentioned, a lot of thought to sort of what is making this country so unhappy, the reasons why you have a crisis of meaning and purpose in America. This data set just confirms what we've been watching in this country for 10 years. I think a big element of American unhappiness is this sense of powerlessness that people have. People feel like they are playing by the rules. Particularly youth, yeah. Right? Who sort of feel like they are playing by the rules, feel like they're doing everything that they are told, and they feel as if sort of success is further and further away. And that sense of powerlessness is in part because they don't feel like democracy is working. So young people are like, I fear for my life when I go to school. The climate is going to be out of reach for me to fix when I become older, and my government's doing nothing about it. But some of it also is that these companies have become so big and so unaccountable and so opaque that people feel a sense of consumer powerlessness because there's no ability to make these companies compete against each other. If you don't like Facebook or you don't like TikTok and you're a young person, there's not a lot of other places to go. So the market doesn't seem to be working either. You're sort of powerless inside.
And you guys are about to take TikTok away, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know that we are going to. And listen, we're struggling to try to get that debate in the Senate right now. But I think people feel powerless both in their democracy and they both feel powerless in the economy.
You've been working with Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, a bit on trying to address this, I call it human connectivity challenge, documented well here in these graphs, but it translates into a profound sense when people are willing to say, I'm lonely. For people to self-articulate,
yeah.
I'm lonely. 1 out of 2 Americans articulate and describe themselves as lonely. What's going on?
Well, a big part of this is really simple. We are just spending far less time with other people than we did 20 years ago. So we have seen a rapid decline in the amount of time you spend every day with peers, for young people, but for older people as well. 20 years ago, the number of Americans who reported having 3 or fewer friends was 25%. Today, that number is 50%. 20 years ago, the number of Americans who said they had 0 friends was 3%. Today, that number is 12%. So, of course, if you were just living your life by yourself more hours of the day, you were going to report feeling lonely. And I just think there is a straight line between that increasing self-reported loneliness, that increasing withdrawal, and rising suicide rates, rising overdose rates, rising violence rates, and a general overall health of the country that has been stagnant for a very long time. So I just think it's time for us to view loneliness as a political issue. It has political consequences. It has health consequences that have cost consequences for the federal government, and we can make different choices to help people find that connection.
Chris, you've sponsored something, I think, or promoted something called Don't Eat Alone Day, or Don't Eat Your Lunch Alone Day, something along those lines, which I found so powerful. But it also made me wonder what's happening with institutions, teachers, schools, communities that aren't proactively realizing that there are a lot of people who just either need permission to meet one another or they need a little bit of a nudge or help. I know this is going to sound shallow, but it's something that I have noticed in Washington. Many parties in Washington really suck. You go to them and you don't know anybody and you sit on the side and you're not connected. You're in a room full of people, but you may feel very alone there. And what I tell our Semafor team and staff, I tell people, and I do it, is walk up to somebody you don't know. You've got more power in the room. Introduce them to another person. Proactively engage people, because I see this. I sort of am wondering, why aren't teachers doing that more? Why aren't others doing that more as a system? I mean, it's nice about eating alone, but what is the institutional failing there that we might be able to fix?
There's sort of a lot to that question, right? I mean, first, I think it's really important to understand that for many of us, the most alone we have ever felt is in the biggest and most populated rooms, right? So part of what is making Americans feel so alone is that there is decreasing uniqueness of local place, right? We now all belong to the same international economy. We all shop from the same national brands. Our culture is flattened. My town is no longer, and my downtown is no longer as unique as it was 30 years ago. And so we now belong to this big thing, and it feels lonely, right? So I think that's that. And so revitalizing sort of the healthy and unique identity of local places, I think is part of what makes us feel less lonely. But no, in our school, listen, I have 2 school-age kids, so I think about this all the time. This obsession with driving to test scores, this increasing sort of assessment of school health based just on academic performance instead of how kids are feeling and how much time they have to connect with each other, I think has been really, really harmful. Kids today believe that the measure of success is their grades, not how they treat each other. And that, I think, ends up with a lot of folks in those schools feeling isolated, lonely, and some of them ending up making some really bad, dangerous, and cataclysmic choices.
So I know this is a big passion point for you. I hear you on the floor Congress. We know about your work with Vivek Murthy. It was with Senator Dan Sullivan the other night, who said it's a huge problem for him as well because he sees an epidemic of suicides among teenage girls in high school. And he said, this is a real problem. And I asked him, what's the literacy of your colleagues in this? How high on the roster of priorities is it for them? So I ask you, Senator, are you able to go to your colleagues across the aisle or within your own caucus and get them to understand what Vivek Murthy said here is, you issued a report warning that loneliness and isolation pose a profound threat to the nation's health and well-being. I mean,
I think there is enormous growing interest on both sides of the aisle to be part of this discussion. Literally on my way here, I was having a discussion about this very topic, rising rates of loneliness and unhappiness, with Pete Ricketts, conservative Republican senator from Nebraska, who has actually got a piece of legislation about sort of assessing loneliness. There are Republican governors like Spencer Cox in Utah that have spent a lot of time sort of thinking about these questions of meaning and purpose and connection. And I think it's really important to build this conversation in a way that sort of doesn't neatly fall into political boxes. And there's a real risk of that happening here. When I first unveiled my bill to set up an office in the federal government to think about the impact of policy on social connection, one of the headlines was, Chris Murphy wants to help you find friends, right? And that doesn't sound like a terribly legitimate...
Well, we're laughing at it, but it's actually not a laughing matter,
It's
right?
not a laughing matter,
yeah.
but when you frame it that way, that sounds like a kind of illegitimate function of government. That sounds like a big government progressive project. It pushes conservatives away. And so I have been very purposeful in these sort of early days of trying to build out a conversation in Washington and nationally around this issue of social connection, to do it in a way that tries to bring in Republicans.
So tell our audience, part of the way you want to do it in your legislation is to create a barrier to access for kids under 13, as I understand it, right? So,
yep, that bill is myself, Senator Brian Schatz, Tom Cotton, and Katie Britt. That's a ideological bouillabaisse, right? And
can't get wilder than that.
You can't get wilder than that. And our bill is tough, right? Our bill says you have to have age verification for social media under 13. Parents have to give consent under 18. And most importantly, you have to turn off the algorithm, that sort of that perfecting algorithm that captures your data and feeds you stuff according to what you swipe and like. You have to turn that off for teenagers. And my hope is whether or not we take up the TikTok bill, that we will have a conversation on TikTok or on our legislation in the Senate this year. I think the American public and parents in particular who are watching their children withdraw into their screen.
Are you pro-ban or pro-divestment?
I would rather broadly regulate social media and have that apply to everything from TikTok to Instagram to Facebook. But I think the one option that is unacceptable is to do nothing. And so I'm open to the House bill, but I would rather take up either my legislation or some version of Senator Blumenthal's legislation.
So let me ask you a cosmic question as we sit here near the end of this. But your thoughts on this? There was a guy, he's a Fox, I think he's still on Fox, commentator, Steve Hilton, who wrote a book called More Human and made a similar argument that human beings were being left behind by a kind of technological determinism, and people were becoming more victims than they were users, and so very close to the same issue with you. But when you kind of think about that question of trying to put more human in, if America does that but Europe doesn't or China doesn't, do you end up with a situation where we may be human in this country but behind in a lot of other categories?
Rip, but isn't it the exact opposite? Right?
I mean,
China is actually being much more thoughtful and protective of its young people when it comes to giving them access to these technologies, right? They don't have this version of TikTok in China, right? They limit the amount of time that every child can be on a social media site. They make sure that embedded into their social media are actual learning opportunities.
So China's got some important stuff for us to learn.
So, and I'll leave you with this. I mean, I had this conversation a couple months ago with a group of kids in my state about this bill. And the thing that they were panicked most about was not the parental consent, but the loss of the algorithm, because they have become so used to being fed on this conveyor belt, things that interest them, connections. They can't imagine not having this technological crutch to engage in these basic rituals of childhood: discovery, exploration, trial and error. And I am just deeply fearful for this country, especially as we lurch into this new era of AI, that these basic human functions, figuring out what you like, and going through the difficult process of trial and error in that endeavor, is going to be replaced by machines. And I think that that is a big part of what leads to this unhappiness. We are not happy when machines do those basic human functions for us.
So if we're here in a year from now, after this election we have coming up, what does your gut tell you? Will we have made any substantial progress on this, or will you lament that we didn't take action?
Oh no, this conversation that you're convening, right, is happening in increasing pace and frequency. And I do think that there is an ability for both parties to come together on some of the beginning elements of doing better when it comes to an issue like social connection. I'm really encouraged by the fact that we do have the ability to bring together Republicans and Democrats around regulating social media. And I think that that would be a really important signal to the country, that we hear you when it comes to this crisis of meaning and purpose and connection, and that we are willing to break through barriers to do something about it. So I'm hopeful.
Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Chris Murphy, thank you so much for joining us, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you.